Okay, so picture this. You pour years of your life into writing a book, and when it finally gets reviewed, it's not just a bad review, it's a 33-page takedown. That's not fiction, it's a real, high-stakes intellectual showdown that played out in the pages of an academic journal over magic, misreadings, and the very nature of how we build knowledge.
It all kicks off right here, inside this 2020 issue of Magic, Ritual, and Witchcraft. A new German book about the history of magic and Islam gets reviewed. And, like I said, this is no ordinary review. It's a massive 33-page essay that was so critical, it prompted a fiery public rebuttal from the book's own authors.
Yeah, the authors Sebastian Günther and Dorothea Pilo, they felt this review completely crossed a line. They basically said, look, this isn't just a critique, it's built on serious misreadings of our work. The errors were so big, they argued, that they needed to be corrected publicly, in the very same journal.
So here's how we're going to break down this academic feud. We'll start with the review that lit the fuse. Then we'll dive into the fight over a single word. After that, we'll get into the big debate. Is magic religion or science? We'll look at the clash between insider and outsider views, see how the authors set the record straight on the facts, and finally, talk about why these kinds of debates really matter.
Okay, first up, let's set the stage. How does a simple book review blow up into a published point-by-point rebuttal?
Well, the review started off kind of nice, you know? It called the book a solid foundation for any future work on the topic. But that's pretty much where the compliments stopped. The other 30-something pages were just packed with really sharp critiques of the book's main arguments and its methods.
For the authors, this was about more than just defending their reputation. It was about defending the entire scholarly process. Their point was, for us to actually learn anything, a debate has to start with an honest and accurate take on what's being discussed, and they felt their book just didn't get that fair shake.
And this is where it gets absolutely fascinating. A huge part of this whole fight, it all boils down to the translation of one single word in the book's original German subtitle.
You can see it right here on the screen. The reviewer takes the German word Glaube and translates it as religion. But the authors say, no, that completely misses the point and actually creates a straw man argument right from the get-go.
And this is so important. Glaube isn't the German word for the institution of religion. That word is just religion. By picking Glaube, the authors were intentionally going for something more personal, like faith or belief. They argue that this one mistranslation is the faulty cornerstone for the reviewer's entire argument that their book wrongly reduces magic to just being religion.
So that one little word, it blows up into the main event of this debate. Does the book unfairly box magic into the category of religion and totally ignore its scientific side?
This is really the heart of the accusation. The reviewer tries to build this case that the book has a massive blind spot, that it's working from this flawed assumption that magic can only be understood as a religious phenomenon.
He claims this basic mistake, this reduction of magic to religion, just muddies the waters for the reader. He says it totally misrepresents how the occult sciences were actually seen in the pre-modern world, where they were often considered totally legitimate fields of scientific study. But the authors, well, they fire right back. And their proof? It's literally in the introduction to their own book. They're basically saying, did you even read it? They point out that they explicitly connect magic to a whole range of disciplines we would call sciences, everything from medicine and math to chemistry and astronomy.
Okay, so the next bone of contention is all about methodology. It's not just what you study, but how you study it. Whose point of view should you prioritize?
The reviewer argues that the authors default to an outsider perspective, imposing modern ideas onto the past. But the authors push back hard. They say, look, our introduction clearly states that we're giving equal time to both the insider views from the past and the outsider analyses from today's scholars.
And then they pull out their trump card. They point out that the entire structure of their book isn't based on some modern European theory. It's organized around the classification system of a 16th century Ottoman scholar. That, they argue, is about as insider as you can get, and it completely undermines the reviewer's claim.
All right, so after tackling the big theoretical arguments, the authors switch gears. Now it's time to correct some specific factual claims they say the reviewer just got plain wrong. First up, the origin of magic squares. The reviewer calls the book's suggestion of a Chinese origin incorrect. The author's response is simple. Hey, this isn't our new hot take. This theory is based on a well-known academic study from all the way back in 1969.
Then there's the topic of geomancy.
The reviewer claims the authors base their whole argument for a Chinese origin on solely one word in one text, but the authors shoot back that he's totally misrepresenting their argument, which is actually built on 4 different structural similarities to ancient Chinese divination practices.
And for the final zinger, they point to a part where the reviewer criticizes one of the book's contributors for supposedly misusing a famous magical text. The author's answer? I wasn't even citing that book. The reviewer critiqued her for using a source she never even mentioned. Ouch.
So, after all that detailed, sometimes nitpicky back and forth, you might be wondering, okay, but why does any of this academic drama matter to the rest of us? And that's a really good question.
Because what we're really seeing here is how knowledge gets made. It can look messy, it can look a little hostile, but this is the process. This kind of intense, evidence-based debate is exactly how ideas get tested, how errors get corrected, and how our collective understanding of history and the world gets just a little bit better, a little more accurate over time.
In their final words, the authors kind of flipped the script on the reviewer. They suggest that he was so focused on criticizing every little detail, every single tree, that he was himself unable to see the forest, missing the bigger, more complex picture that their book was actually presenting.
And all this leaves us with a pretty big question, doesn't it? When the experts disagree this intensely, how are we supposed to figure out what's true? Watching them take each other's work apart, piece by piece, really shows you just how challenging and how incredibly important careful reading and fair representation really are.
All right, so I want you to imagine something. Picture it's the 15th century. The world, as you know it, feels like it's completely falling apart. But in the middle of all that chaos, one scholar is convinced he's found a secret code, a divine key to not only understand the past, but to literally unlock the future. This is the incredible story of Abdurrahman al-Bastami and his prophetic universe.
See, to really get al-Bastami, you've got to understand the world he was living in. He was writing in the immense shadow of the conqueror Timur. You might know him as Tamerlane, whose armies left just a trail of unbelievable destruction across Asia. This quote here, that's his own gut-wrenching reaction to the brutal sacking of Aleppo. This wasn't history to him. It was raw, present-day reality, a world of absolute chaos.
And all that chaos, well, it raises this huge, profound question, one that was really haunting people back then. When everything around you seems random and brutal and meaningless, how do you find any kind of order? How do you even begin to look for God's plan in all that bloodshed?
So enter our guy, al-Bastami. Now, he wasn't just some dusty scholar in a library. He was a Sufi mystic, an expert in the occult sciences, and a pretty influential intellectual. And for him, the answer to that massive question wasn't just about having faith. It was in a system. He genuinely believed that the entire universe was a book written by God, and if you could just learn to read the alphabet, you could understand the whole divine story.
So this gets us to his master key, the way he thought you could unlock everything. It's a mystical practice called Ilm al-Huruf, or the science of letters. And trust me, it's probably not what you think.
Yeah, so letterism isn't about grammar or spelling. The core idea is that the universe itself is literally made out of God's speech. For thinkers like al-Bastami, the letters of the Arabic alphabet weren't just symbols for sounds. No. They were the fundamental cosmic building blocks of all reality. Each letter held its own secret power, its own piece of the universal puzzle.
And this really shows you just how different his worldview was from ours. We generally see history as a straight line, right? A record of human actions based on cause and effect. Al-Bastami saw it completely differently. For him, time moved in repeating cycles. It was a coded message where every single event, every person, was basically an unfolding of one of God's divine names, like the just or the all-powerful, being made real here on Earth.
Okay, so if the universe is a code, how in the world do you actually read it? Well, the main tool is something called Hisab al-Jumal, which you might know by its more general name, gematria. The idea is simple. Every Arabic letter has a specific number assigned to it. So you can take any word, a person's name, a place, a date, add up the values of its letters, and uncover this whole secret mathematical layer hidden just beneath the surface of language.
Let me give you a perfect example of how this works. Take the prophet Moses, Musa in Arabic. If you add up the numerical values of the letters in his name, you get 116. Now, look at the divine name al-Qawi, which means the all-powerful. Guess what its numerical value is? Also 116. For al-Bastami, this isn't some cute coincidence. No way.
This is cosmic proof that Moses was the earthly manifestation of that specific attribute of God's power.
Now here's a really crucial piece of the puzzle. Al-Bastami wasn't saying he made any of this up. Not at all. He believed this science of letters was an ancient secret wisdom that had been passed down through a hidden lineage of humanity, a lineage he was now revealing to the world.
And what a lineage it is! The whole thing starts with Adam, the first man, who gets this secret knowledge directly from God. It's then passed down to prophets like Idris, who's often identified with the Greek figure Hermes, and Abraham. But here's the wild part. The chain even includes non-prophets. Pagan Greek philosophers like Thales of Miletus were believed to have tapped into this divine knowledge. And finally, the full, ultimate potential of this science is realized with the Prophet Muhammad and his cousin Ali, who becomes the great keeper of this tradition inside Islam.
So you take all this secret knowledge, this ancient chain of wisdom, and what does it unlock? It unlocks al-Bastami's grand theory of history, this enormous, divinely engineered cosmic clock, where absolutely everything happens for a reason, at a very specific, preordained time.
And at the very heart of this cosmic clock is one single number, 7,000. The central idea is that the entire story of humanity unfolds over a period of exactly 7,000 years, period.
And check this out. Here's the actual blueprint for all of time. Each of the 7 millennia is governed by a specific planet and inaugurated by a major prophet. The first 1,000 years, that belongs to Saturn and Adam. The 6th millennium is ruled by Mercury and kicked off by Jesus. And the 7th and final millennium, the age al-Bastami himself was living in, belongs to the moon and the prophet Muhammad. It's this beautiful, perfect fusion of astrology, prophecy, and history.
But hold on, it gets even more detailed than that. We can zoom in. Inside each of these massive 1,000-year ages, you have smaller 100-year cycles. And at the dawn of every century, God sends a renewer. It could be a saint, maybe a just king, whose job is to fight back against the inevitable decay of the world and pull humanity back on track. So history becomes this constant rhythm, this cosmic tug of war between renewal and decay, order and chaos.
Okay, so this is where it all comes together. This is the climax. Al-Bastami takes this entire intricate cosmic system, the letters, the numbers, the planets, the cycles, and points it directly at his own chaotic times. He was convinced he was living at the very tail end of that final 7th millennium, and what he saw coming was absolutely terrifying. His prediction for the century that was just about to dawn was just chilling. He wasn't just forecasting a difficult period, he called it the mother of all centuries with regard to calamities. In his view, the horror of Timur's invasions wasn't the end, it was just the opening act for the final, terrible chapter of human history.
I mean, just look at the timeline he and his sources calculated using these methods. By the year we'd call 1497, the Qur'an itself would be abolished, the faith gone. Then, a 93-year spiritual black hole where literally no one on earth would know God. The end of the world as we know it was calculated for 1582. Think about that. For people already living through plague and conquest, this wasn't some abstract philosophy. This was an imminent, calculated, terrifying countdown clock.
So in the end, al-Bastami's world is a radical challenge to how we think. For him, history wasn't just a record of things that did happen, it was a sacred text revealing what must happen. His whole system was this profound, desperate search for certainty in an age of utter chaos. And it kind of leaves us with a question for our own time, doesn't it? In our own turbulent world, what codes are we all trying to decipher, just to make sense of it all?
All right, today we're cracking a case that's been cold for, about 900 years. It's a story about a brilliant philosopher, a hidden identity, and a radical idea that was sitting right out in the open the whole time. We're talking about Averroes, the secret innovator. So every good detective story needs a starting point, right? Our guide for this whole thing is a book by Ruth Glassner, Averroes Physics. It's our roadmap, helping us uncover clues that have been buried for centuries in the philosopher's own work.
You see, for hundreds of years, if you said the name Averroes, people thought of one thing: the commentator. His whole reputation was built on being Aristotle's most dedicated, some even said slavish, follower. He was seen as a brilliant scholar for sure, but not an original thinker. His job was just to explain the master, not to add anything new.
But here's the twist. What if that entire reputation was just a cover story? What if the world's most famous interpreter was secretly one of its boldest innovators? And that's the puzzle we're digging into right now. So how do we find the real Averroes? Well, we do what any good investigator does. We follow the evidence. And luckily for us, the guy left a huge paper trail. The clues we need are hiding in plain sight, inside the very books that made him famous. Throughout his career, Averroes wrote 3 different sets of commentaries on Aristotle's work. This is our evidence. Okay, so first up, you've got the short commentary. Think of it as the Cliff's Notes version, an epitome. Then he wrote the middle commentary, which is more of a detailed paraphrase. And then the big one, the long commentary. This thing is a super detailed, word-for-word analysis. The whole shebang. Okay, but here's where the plot really thickens. It's when modern scholars started putting these old translations side by side, the Hebrew versions next to the Latin ones. They figured, hey, they should say the same thing, right? Well, they didn't. And this is our first huge clue. In one version, you see a key argument about physics laid out one way. But then you look at another translation of the exact same book, and that argument is totally different. Now, this isn't just a typo or a simple mistake. Something much more interesting is going on here. And that weird inconsistency? Well, that's what leads us directly to the big breakthrough in this whole case. It turns out these weren't mistakes in translation. Not at all. This was Averroes himself going back and deliberately changing his own work, updating his ideas and refining his thoughts over decades. You can literally watch his ideas evolve over his career. It's almost like he was releasing software, you know? You get the short commentary version 1.0 in 1159, then the middle commentary a decade later. But he was never done. He was constantly going back, patching, updating, and releasing new versions of his own thoughts. And you can really hear the struggle and the hard work in his own writing. He'd write things like, "After an intensive inquiry in a long time, it seems to me." This isn't someone just copying and pasting. This is a real, active mind wrestling with massive problems over a long, long time. Okay, so this raises a huge question. If Averroes was coming up with brand new ideas, why all the secrecy? And how on earth did he manage to hide them so perfectly inside a commentary on someone else's work? Well, it turns out he had a system, a really clever, repeatable method for sneaking in these totally radical ideas, all while looking like he was just being a loyal follower. Ruth Glasner, our guide here, calls it the turning point pattern, and it's basically a 5-step playbook for innovation. Step 1, he finds a confusing part in Aristotle. Step 2, he blames all the other commentators for messing it up. Step 3, he talks about how much he struggled with it. Step 4, and this is the genius move, he presents his own brand new idea as what Aristotle actually meant all along. And Step 5, he finishes by saying how brilliant Aristotle was, perfectly covering his tracks. And get this, he wasn't even that shy about it, at least not if you read closely. He'd subtly say things like, since he understood what all the commentators missed, his own opinion was more adequate. It was hiding his genius, but just barely. So, what was the big secret? What was this revolutionary idea that needed this whole elaborate song and dance? It was huge. We're talking about a whole new theory of physics. He developed something that scholars now call Aristotelian atomism. And what that is his own unique physical system that did something nobody thought was possible. It merged Aristotle's philosophy with the theory of atomism. To really get how wild this was, you need to understand that these two ideas were like total opposites. In Aristotle's world, everything is continuous, smooth stuff that you could just keep dividing forever. Atomists, on the other hand, believed everything was made of tiny, indivisible bits, atoms, with empty space between them. These two worldviews were fundamentally at war. Trying to combine them was like trying to mix oil and water on a cosmic scale. But Averroes, using his method, found a way. He introduced this brilliant concept he called minima naturalia, or natural minimums. Think of it this way. He argued there's a smallest possible bit of water that can still be water. If you divide it any further, it's not water anymore. And just like that, with that one idea, he built a bridge between these two impossible philosophies. It was a quiet revolution in physics, all disguised as simple commentary. So where does that leave us? What's the verdict? Well, the evidence is in. The case of the secret innovator is officially closed. And the verdict is Averroes was absolutely not just a commentator. He was what Glassner calls an exegetical scientist, a thinker who made scientific breakthroughs not with a telescope, but by wrestling with ancient books. And his story really shows us something important. Progress doesn't always come from some brand new invention. Sometimes the biggest leaps forward come from looking at old ideas in a completely new way.
All right, let's just run through the key takeaways from our investigation. 1. Averroes was way more than just the commentator. 2. The changes he made to his own work are like a breadcrumb trail tracking his genius. 3. He used that clever 5-step turning point pattern to innovate in secret. And 4. The end result was a mind-blowing new theory, Aristotelian atomism, that ended up shaping science for centuries to come. And all this leaves us with one last really big question to chew on. If a thinker as famous as Averroes could hide such a revolutionary idea in plain sight for centuries, well, it makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many other great innovations are still out there, just waiting for us to find them, disguised as simple commentary? For hundreds of years, there's one name in the Islamic world that's always been linked with forbidden knowledge, with dark magic. But what if that whole story is just wrong? Today, we're going to dive into the archives to uncover the truth about a medieval scholar whose books went viral and created a legend that honestly is still going strong. So this is the big question, right? Was this man, Ahmad al-Buni, a master of the occult, a sorcerer cooking up spells? Or was he something completely different, a misunderstood genius whose real work got buried under centuries of myths and legends? You see, on the one hand, you got the legend, all about dark magic and powerful incantations. But then, on the other hand, you have the actual physical evidence, these ancient manuscripts that tell a totally different and, frankly, a much more interesting story. We're going to follow the evidence. And to do that, we have to start with the man at the center of it all. So who exactly was this mysterious figure, Ahmad al-Buni? Okay, let's go back in time. We're in the 13th century. Ahmad al-Buni was an Egyptian Sufi scholar, so a mystic and intellectual. He wrote a bunch of stuff, but it's what he wrote about that would eventually make him, well, infamous. And you know what? That reputation really stuck. For a long, long time, as this quote shows, modern historians just kind of wrote him off. They slapped the label magician on him and said his work was basically irrelevant, just a weird little footnote. But they were missing something huge. To find the real al-Buni, we can't just rely on legends or, modern paperback editions of his books. Nope. We have to become historical detectives. We have to go straight to the source, the original medieval manuscripts themselves. Which leads to the big question. If the popular story is so off, where do we even look for the truth? Well, the answer is hidden away in hundreds of delicate, handwritten documents, scattered in libraries all over the world. And this is exactly why going to the originals is so important. See, the modern printed books you can buy today, they're often super misleading, full of mistakes and changes that people added over the centuries. But the original manuscripts, they're like time capsules. They're our best witnesses, bringing us closer to al-Buni himself and showing us how people actually read his stuff back then. And we are talking about a massive amount of work. To get to the bottom of this, researchers had to track down and examine around 350 copies of his works. That is some serious historical detective work, digging through centuries of handwriting to piece this puzzle together. So what did all that digging actually turn up? Well, the very first clue was a game changer. It turns out al-Buni wasn't writing for just anyone. He was writing for a very specific, very secret audience. This is what al-Buni was really an expert in. It's called the science of letters. And forget what you're picturing, no spooky cauldrons or anything like that. This was a super complex, esoteric field of study. The people who practiced it believed that God literally created the universe through divine speech, which meant the letters of the alphabet were the actual building blocks of all reality. Here, check this out. This gives you a little glimpse of how it worked. Every single letter in the Arabic alphabet also had a numerical value. So, scholars like al-Buni believed that if you could understand these numbers and their relationships, you could decode the hidden blueprint of the cosmos, you could achieve spiritual enlightenment, and maybe even channel divine power. It was like spiritual mathematics. And the manuscripts make it crystal clear this knowledge was not for everybody.
Al-Buni's books were meant for these small, closed-off communities of other Sufi scholars. It was basically a form of advanced, secret teaching passed carefully from a master to a student. Okay, so if his work was so secret, how on earth did he become this infamous magician? This is where the story takes a really fascinating turn. The ideas, they escaped. They went mainstream, and that's when everything got complicated. This chart right here tells the whole story. Back in al-Buni's own lifetime, in the 13th century, there were very few copies of his books, which, makes sense for a secret practice. But then look what happens in the 14th and especially the 15th centuries, 200 years after he died. It's an explosion. His work basically went viral, but in the age of handwritten books. So who was suddenly reading all these books? Well, this picture gives us a huge clue. It's a little note in a gorgeous, very expensive manuscript, and it says it was copied for a powerful Mamluk court official. This wasn't some humble mystic anymore. We're talking about the 1% of their day. And that's the key. Al-Buni's writings jumped from the fringes of society, from these little secret study groups, right into the mainstream of power. The ruling elites, the top government officials, the rich patrons, suddenly, they all had to have a copy. So now that we've looked at the manuscripts and we've traced how his ideas spread like wildfire, we can finally bring our investigation to a close and deliver a verdict on the mysterious Mr. al-Buni. Let's go back to that central question one last time. After everything we've seen, after all this evidence, was he really a magician? The answer is a clear no. The real story the evidence tells is so much richer, so much more complex than just slapping the label magician on him. His writings weren't spellbooks. They were a key to a whole lost intellectual world, a really sophisticated, esoteric way of thinking that was once taken very, very seriously by the most powerful people in society. So here's the final breakdown. Al-Buni was a highly specialized Sufi scholar. His books were originally meant only for a small group of insiders. But centuries later, they were rediscovered by this huge, new audience that didn't really have the full context to understand them. And it was that viral popularity long after he was gone that stripped away all the nuance and created the legend of the master magician we know today. And all of this just leaves you with one final thought, right? The real story of al-Buni was hiding in plain sight this whole time, in libraries and archives, just waiting for someone to reread it properly. It really makes you wonder what other secrets, what other misunderstood geniuses are still out there, just waiting to be discovered in the margins of history. History is just packed with secret societies, but, well, few were as ambitious as this one. Today, we're diving into the world of the Muslim Neoplatonists, a mysterious group from the Islamic Golden Age who tried to do something incredible: synthesize all of human knowledge into one single unified system. An obscure puzzle and a padlocked treasure. That's not me saying that. That's how modern scholars describe the work of a group called the Brethren of Purity. They worked completely in the shadows, and they left behind this massive encyclopedia that was also a kind of spiritual guide. But their actual identities, that remained a very, very carefully guarded secret. So, who were the Brethren of Purity, or the Ikhwan al-Safa in Arabic? I mean, for centuries, figuring that out has been one of history's great intellectual puzzles. Our goal today isn't just to try and unmask them, but to really understand the massive project they dedicated their entire lives to. Okay, so here's what we know for sure. Let's set the scene. We're in the 10th century in Basra, which was this bustling city in what's now Iraq. And this group, they were a secret society of philosophers working together. And what did they leave behind? Their legacy is this huge collection of 52 treatises. They called them epistles. And they cover literally everything from math and music to embryology and, yes, even magic. And when I say secret, I mean their secrecy was wildly successful. Early Arabic sources can't even agree on their names. And to this day, we know almost nothing about them as individuals. You see, they wanted their ideas to stand on their own, completely separate from any single author. So if they left so few clues about themselves, how do we even begin to understand them? Well, the best way is to look at the ideas they used. And their main intellectual toolkit? It came straight from the ancient Greeks, whose major philosophical works had, by then, been translated into Arabic. But, and this is so important, they weren't just copying and pasting. Not at all. They were acting like critical editors. They were very selective, picking and choosing and reinterpreting Greek ideas to build something totally new, a system that fit their own unique vision of the universe. Take Pythagoras, for example. The Brethren were absolutely fascinated by his ideas about a universe built on mathematical rules. They completely bought into the powerful concept that a human being is a microcosm, basically a mini version of the entire cosmos. But that other big Pythagorean idea, reincarnation, the whole transmigration of the soul, nope, they rejected it completely. And we see this exact same pick-and-choose approach with Plato. They loved his idea that the body can be a prison for the soul, distracting it from finding pure knowledge. But they totally rejected his theory of recollection, this idea that learning is just your soul remembering a past life. For the Brethren, nope, knowledge had to be gained right here, right now, through reason and your senses. Their relationship with Aristotle was, you could say, even more complicated. They basically adopted his entire system of logic, concepts like form, matter, substance, the four causes. That became the foundation of their science. But they rejected one of his most fundamental conclusions. Aristotle argued the universe was eternal, that it had always existed. For the Brethren, that was a bridge too far. The universe had to be created by God. A universe without a creator was, to them, just unthinkable. Okay, so they're borrowing from Pythagoras, from Plato, from Aristotle, but what was the glue holding all these different pieces together? This brings us to the master key, the thing that really unlocks their entire system. And that key is Neoplatonism. Now, this was developed by a philosopher named Plotinus centuries after Plato. And Neoplatonism offered this beautiful, grand, unified picture of reality. Just imagine that everything that exists flows outward from a single, perfect, unknowable source. They called it the One, kind of like light radiating out from the sun. And this idea gave them their cosmic hierarchy. For the Brethren, creation wasn't just a single event, it was a cascade. So at the top, you have the Creator, the One. From the Creator flows the universal intellect. From that intellect comes the universal soul, which then gives shape to prime matter. And finally, our physical world takes form. This 5-step process was the absolute backbone of their entire worldview. But here's the thing. When you try to blend so many different systems, you've got Greek philosophy on one hand, Islamic theology on the other, you are bound to run into some fascinating tensions and even some outright contradictions. And this is where their project gets really ambitious. And this created a huge conflict right at the center of their thinking. How do you square the God of Neoplatonism with the God of the Qur'an? The Neoplatonic One is this abstract, distant, unknowable source that acts indirectly. But the Islamic Allah is a personal God, one who sends prophets and actually answers your prayers. The Brethren tried to fuse these two, and what they ended up with was a really complex and at times contradictory view of God. And get this, it wasn't just Greek philosophy they were mixing in. Their encyclopedia is just this amazing testament to their boundless curiosity. They pulled in elements from Islamic mysticism, what we call Sufism, from Hermetic texts on astrology and magic, from Mu'tazile-like theology about free will, and even from Gnostic, Indian, and Persian traditions. It was a truly global synthesis of ideas. Now, this kind of intellectual melting pot led to some pretty tricky philosophical knots. For instance, from Hermeticism, they brought in astrology, the idea that the planets influence our destiny. But from the Mu'tazilites, they had this firm belief in human free will. So which one is it? Are our lives mapped out by the stars, or are we actually free to choose our own path? It's a tension they never really managed to resolve. So what was the point of all this? Why undertake such a gigantic, secret project to synthesize all of human knowledge? Well, the answer lies in their ultimate goal, which they described with this incredibly powerful metaphor. I mean, they said it themselves. This was their mission statement. They weren't just collecting facts for fun. They really believed that by uniting all these different philosophies and sciences, they could create a single, clear path to truth and, ultimately, to salvation. And this is that central metaphor, the ship of salvation. This is what their 52 epistles, their grand encyclopedia, what it all really was. It wasn't just a collection of texts, it was a vessel. For the Brethren, we are all souls lost in a vast sea of matter, kind of imprisoned in our physical bodies. And knowledge, all of it, from arithmetic to theology, was the timber they used to build a ship strong enough to navigate the stormy seas of the material world and carry the purified soul all the way back home, back to that divine source where it came from in the first place. And all this really leaves us with the big question, the one that's at the very heart of the Brethren's entire project. Is truth found in one single, pure, exclusive teaching, or is it something you can only discover by weaving together threads from every tradition, every science, and every philosophy? The Brethren of Purity made their choice 1,000 years ago, and honestly, it's a question we're still grappling with today. Today, we're jumping into a fascinating story about what happens when a civilization hits a crisis point. It's about collapse, chaos, and the radical new ideas that can spring up. We're looking at two totally different visions for how to save the world, one from a legendary philosopher and the other from a super mysterious secret society. But first, let me ask you something. When it feels like your world is breaking down, politically, socially, maybe even spiritually, where do you even start to look for an answer? It's a question that feels so current, right? But it's the exact same problem that sparked two of the most incredible intellectual movements of the 10th century. All right, so to really get why their answers were so revolutionary, we first have to understand the sheer scale of the crisis they were living through. And saying it was in turmoil is, well, putting it mildly. The 10th century Islamic world was literally falling apart at the seams. That sense of political and religious unity that had defined the great Abbasid Caliphate, it was shattering. And this wasn't just a political headache. For the people living through it, it was an existential crisis. What's really wild is just how fast this all happened. In 99, boom, the Fatimans rise up and declare their own caliphate in North Africa. Just 20 years later, the ruler over in Spain does the exact same thing. And before you know it, by 932, the original caliphate in Baghdad is in total freefall. You've got military warlords basically running the show, appointing and firing caliphs like it's nothing. The center was just gone. So all of a sudden, you have three rival leaders in different corners of the world, all claiming to be the one true successor to the Prophet Muhammad. Can you imagine the chaos, the confusion? This was that deep political and spiritual malaise that had thinkers just desperate to find a solution. So right in the middle of this mess, our first figure steps onto the scene with a bold, incredibly structured plan. Let's take a look at the philosopher's blueprint. Meet al-Farabi, and let me tell you, this guy was no small-time thinker. He was an absolute titan. They called him the second teacher, right after Aristotle. He's pretty much considered the founder of political philosophy in the Islamic world. This was a man who believed in logic, in order, and in the power of reason above everything else. So what was his grand solution to all this chaos? He wanted to build something totally new, something he thought would be perfect. He imagined a virtuous regime, a state run not by warlords or shaky alliances, but by pure, undeniable reason and philosophical truth. He was drawing heavily on Plato and Aristotle, creating this perfectly logical top-down blueprint for society. And it's really important to mention, this whole breakdown, this entire story, it all comes directly from some seriously deep academic work, like this doctoral thesis right here that compares these two worldviews. So we're getting right to the heart of the scholarly debate. But al-Farabi wasn't the only one with a plan. A second, much more mysterious answer was starting to bubble up from the shadows. This was the secret society's vision. And this is where we meet the Brethren of Purity. Now, unlike the famous singular figure of al-Farabi, these guys were a total mystery, an anonymous collective. To this day, we still don't know exactly who they were. What they left behind is this massive encyclopedia, 52 letters or epistles covering literally everything: math, music, science, theology, the whole shebang. And their solution had a completely different vibe. It wasn't about one single rational blueprint. It was eclectic. They believed that if they could spread all kinds of knowledge, scientific, mystical, and religious, they could actually purify individual souls. And by doing that, they could heal a sick society from the bottom up. Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting. For a long time, a lot of scholars looked at these two philosophies and kind of lumped them together, like they were basically saying the same thing. But is that right? Are they really identical twins, or are they total strangers? And, you can totally see why people got confused. I mean, look at the similarities here. They both popped up in the same chaotic century. They both were reacting to the same societal mess. They both tried to figure out what was wrong, and this is the big one, they both offered a cure to build a better world. The parallels are pretty striking. But, and this is the absolute key, if you dig just 1 inch deeper, you find a massive, fundamental difference that changes absolutely everything. For Al-Farabi, the ultimate source of truth was human reason. For the Brethren of Purity, it was divine revelation. And this is the heart of the matter. This isn't just some minor disagreement on a finer point. This is a head-on collision of worldviews. We're talking reason versus revelation.
And the source material just lays it out so clearly. Let me read this part directly. The thrust of this study is to show that the political ideas of Al-Farabi and the Brethren are far from being identical. They stem from 2 entirely different perspectives. One philosophical, the other basically religious. It couldn't be clearer. One is a project of the mind, the other is a project of faith.
So, here's the bottom line. Al-Farabi's whole project was an exercise in pure logic. He was trying to construct the perfect state from the ground up using reason. The Brethren, on the other hand, their encyclopedia was an act of faith, an attempt to gather all knowledge to bring humanity back to a divine truth. And that leaves us with a huge question that echoes from their century right into ours. When society feels broken and nobody knows the way forward, what's our ultimate guide? Is it the cold, hard clarity of human reason, or is it the deep conviction of the human soul? It's a debate they kicked off 1,000 years ago, and, well, we're definitely still having it today.
Okay, we are about to pull back the curtain on a part of history that's been, well, completely misunderstood, pretty much ignored, and honestly deliberately quarantined for centuries. Today we're going to de-orient occultism and dig into the hidden history of Islamicate science.
But first, let me ask you something. When you hear the word occultism, what's the very first thing that pops into your head? Seriously, just let the images come. What do you see?
For most of us, it's probably images of superstition, right? Maybe something kind of like pseudoscience. We've been taught to think of it as a sign of intellectual rot, a symptom of a culture in decline. That's the story we all know.
But what if I told you that story is just wrong? What if, for hundreds of years, in some of the most advanced societies on the planet, these so-called occult sciences were actually considered the absolute peak of scientific and philosophical achievement? Yeah, that's the reality we're going to unpack.
But there's a huge problem in how we even study this history. There's this massive double standard. And it turns out, how we view the occult depends entirely on whether we're looking west or east.
I mean, just look at this contrast. In the West, scholars now freely admit that giants like Isaac Newton and Johannes Kepler were deeply into occultism. It's now seen as a load-bearing structure of modernity itself. But when we look at Islamicate societies, the exact same pursuits are dismissed as proof of degeneracy. The occult work of their most celebrated thinkers is either totally ignored or, worse, written off as the rantings of wild-eyed Oriental mystics. It's a staggering intellectual hypocrisy.
In fact, this whole area of history has been treated like a contagion under strict quarantine. It's been deliberately walled off, labeled as suspicious, and because of that, it remains just grossly understudied.
And yep, there's a name for this academic prejudice: scholarly occultophobia. It's this ingrained fear of taking these sciences seriously, a bias that has completely distorted our picture of intellectual history.
So let's fix that. It's time to understand what these sciences actually were. And the very first thing you need to know is that this was not simple folklore or village superstition, not even close. In Arabic, the term they used was al-ulum al-ghariba. Now, that doesn't mean spooky sciences, it means the difficult or unusual sciences. The name itself tells you this was an elite, highly advanced pursuit. To even begin studying them, you first had to master other really tough fields, like mathematics and natural philosophy.
And that word, occult, it's just a direct translation of the Arabic word khafi, which means hidden. But here's the key. It referred to the subject matter, the hidden forces of nature, not its social status. This wasn't something shameful being done in the shadows. It was a high-status, totally respected field of study.
So just how prestigious are we talking? Well, according to a famous intellectual group from the 10th century, the Brethren of Purity, this was basically the path to ultimate knowledge. You'd start with arithmetic, you'd work your way through natural sciences and metaphysics, and only then, at the very peak of your education, would you graduate to the sciences of alchemy, astrology, and magic. They were the capstone of all learning.
So, when was all this happening? Far from being a sign of decline, this was the cutting-edge science of a golden age, sponsored and practiced at the absolute highest levels of society.
Starting in the 14th century, a veritable renaissance of high occultism just exploded onto the scene. It became central to how empires saw themselves. Emperors and sultans weren't just funding it. Many were active practitioners. For centuries, this was the main way of understanding the cosmos and the very nature of power.
And let's be really clear about something. This intellectual explosion wasn't happening in a bubble. It actually came before, ran alongside, and in many ways outpaced the more famous occultist developments we hear about from the European Renaissance.
So who exactly are we talking about here? I mean, the list is basically a who's who of the era. You've got legendary emperors from the Mughal, Ottoman, and Safavid empires. You've got sultan scientists like Ulu Beg, whose observatory was world famous. Philosophers, mathematicians, historians, the biggest and brightest minds of the age were all deeply involved in these sciences.
But this wasn't some static, dusty old belief system. No way. Like any real science, it was dynamic, it evolved, and it was fiercely debated. And you can see this evolution so clearly when you look at two of the most important books of the time.
So, first you have a phase of natural magic, and the key text is called the Picatrix. In this view, magic is basically a natural science. It's rooted in Greek philosophy, and the whole idea is that you can tap into hidden powers by rationally understanding the cause and effect links between the stars and the Earth. Think of it as applied physics, but for cosmic forces. But then, there's this huge shift to what we call sanctified magic, led by a book called The Sun of Gnosis. Here, the worldview completely changes. Now, real power comes directly from divine revelation. It's a secret knowledge given only to a spiritual elite. You couldn't just learn it from a textbook, you had to experience it.
This was an absolutely epochal sanctification. Magic went from being a branch of natural philosophy to being a sacred science, and that made it both incredibly bold in its claims about reality and, crucially, completely legitimate within the official theology of the time.
Okay, so we've seen the double standard, we've seen how elite these sciences were, and how they evolved. But why does digging all this up actually matter today? What's the point?
Well, it matters because the history of science has been colonized. A very narrow, Eurocentric idea of what science, with a capital S, is, was forced onto the past, and it just stripped it of all its richness and complexity. So to fix this, the history of Islamicate science has to be decolonized and re-enchanted. We have to see it for what it truly was, on its own terms.
And look, this isn't just about adding some quirky facts about magic to the history books. The real goal here is to de-orientalize and de-other Islam, to break down these damaging stereotypes that have painted it as irrational, unscientific, and somehow separate from the grand story of modernity. Which really leaves us with a pretty big question to chew on, doesn't it? If a centuries-long, elite, imperial scientific tradition could be so completely misunderstood and hidden right there in plain sight, what else are we missing? What other crucial parts of our shared human history have been totally written out of the story?
All right, so today we're diving into something really cool, a kind of medieval literature that you've probably never heard of. And trust me, these were way more than just stories. Think of them as philosophical tools, these epic journeys that were specifically designed to mix pure hard logic with the wild creative power of the imagination. Now, to get what they were doing, we actually have to go way back, thousands of years ago. Socrates, or, Plato writing as Socrates, he pointed out this huge problem. He called it an ancient and virulent quarrel between philosophy and literature. Basically, a huge battle between the world of pure reason and the world of imagination. So what does that fight even look like? Well, it breaks down like this. On one side, you've got philosophy. That's the intellect's turf, right? It's all about finding these big, universal truths that never change. And on the other side, you've got literature. That's the imagination's playground. It's all about specific characters, their messy lives, and all the unpredictable stuff that happens. For a long, long time, these two were seen as complete opposites. You had to pick a side. But what if that whole division was just wrong? What if you didn't have to choose? What if a group of seriously brilliant medieval thinkers, and we're talking about people from different cultures, different religions, found a way to bring these two worlds crashing together? Well, they did. They created this amazing thing we can call the initiatory tale. And listen, this wasn't just some boring philosophy essay with a few characters thrown in. No way. This was a whole new genre. It used poetry and allegory to create a roadmap for this incredible journey of personal transformation, A journey where the final destination was, well, it was to grasp the divine, but using your imagination. And at the center of a lot of these stories, you'll find this one character who keeps popping up. He's our guide, and his name is Hayb ibn Yaqzan. Now, his name is a huge clue to what this is all about. It literally translates to living the sun of awake. I mean, come on, that's pretty direct, right? It's all about a journey of waking up, spiritually and intellectually. This is where it gets really interesting, because this one story, this tale of Hay, it gets passed around and remixed over 2 centuries by 3 absolute masters. It kicks off in the 10th century with the Persian Muslim philosopher Avicenna. Then it gets a new life from the Spanish Jewish scholar Abraham ibn Ezra. And finally, it's totally reimagined by another Spanish Muslim, Ibn Tufayl. It's the same basic story, but each one put their own incredible spin on it. Okay, so first up is Avicenna. He laid down the original blueprint back in the 10th century. In his version, our wise sage Hay, he meets a seeker. And he doesn't take him on a journey, he describes it to him. It's like he's handing over a detailed map of the entire spiritual universe. Fast forward about a century. Ibn Ezra takes that map from Avicenna and says, okay, let's actually go on the trip. So his main character doesn't just sit and listen to the description, he gets up and actually goes on the journey. And Ibn Ezra rewrites the whole thing in this gorgeous, poetic Hebrew, and he fills it with imagery from the Bible so it would really hit home for his Jewish readers. And then you get Ibn Tufayl, and he just flips the whole thing on its head. In his story, Hay isn't the guide anymore. He's the main character. He's this guy who grows up totally alone on a deserted island, a complete autodidact, and just by using his own brain, pure reason and observation, he figures out the deepest truths of the universe. All by himself. It's this incredible thought experiment about what the human mind is capable of, completely on its own. So you gotta ask, right? How in the world could these stories even begin to describe the indescribable? I mean, we're talking about God, the divine, things that are supposed to be beyond words. Well, they did it by taking something that philosophy had trashed for centuries, and they turned it into a superpower. What was it? It was the imagination. Yep, the very thing Socrates was so worried about. You know, the fickle, unreliable, image-obsessed part of our minds. That becomes the key to everything. These thinkers were arguing that to really understand the divine, you couldn't just think your way there. You had to, in a very real sense, see it. You had to picture it. The scholar Elliot Wolfson puts this just perfectly. He says that for these medieval writers, imagination wasn't some tool you used after you had a mystical experience to try and explain it to people. No. The sensory images that your imagination created, that was the experience. You didn't just see images of the divine. You experience the divine through the images. So how does that even work? Okay, think of it in 3 steps. First, your imagination is like a collector. It gathers up everything from your senses, all the sights, the sounds, the feelings. Step 2, it acts like an artist. It takes all that raw data and mashes it up, creating new images and symbols that can represent the spiritual world. And then step 3, the magic part. This whole process lets you have a direct personal experience of something that before was just a totally abstract idea. To put it really simply, the whole point was to give a body to the bodiless. That's it. It's about taking these huge, transcendent, invisible ideas and making them accessible, making them feel tangible, making them something you can actually see with your mind's eye. And this ties right into how they thought about beauty or aesthetics. For them, when you saw something beautiful in the world, it wasn't just, in the eye of the beholder. The harmony in a piece of music, the order in a beautiful painting, that was a real physical echo of a much higher spiritual kind of beauty. Basically, all the beautiful stuff in our world, they were like signposts, all pointing you in the direction of the divine. Okay, so this brings us back to that really important question. If this is all just deep philosophy, why didn't they just write a regular old philosophical essay? Lay it all out logically. Why go through all the trouble of writing these incredible, poetic, epic stories? Because, and this is the key to everything, for these thinkers, philosophy wasn't just some intellectual game you play. It wasn't about winning an argument in a classroom. It was supposed to actually change you. They saw philosophy as a way of life. That's a phrase from the modern scholar Pierre Hadot, but it captures their idea perfectly. The whole point wasn't just to know something new. It was to become someone new. Philosophy was a practice, something you did to purify your soul and completely transform who you are as a person. And that's what these stories were. They were tools. They were practical guides for that transformation. They were literally engineered to do more than just feed you information. They were meant to spark real insight, to guide you on your own personal journey. And by using a story, they could talk to your whole being, not just your brain, but your senses, your emotions, all of it. They made philosophy something you didn't just think about, but something you actually lived. So that leaves us with the same powerful question that these medieval masters were asking all those centuries ago. What if the biggest, most important truths out there aren't things you can just think your way to? What if they're things that have to be experienced, felt and seen with every part of who you are? All right, today we're going to peel back the centuries to look at some images that are, well, so much more than they seem. We're diving into the world of a 13th century Sufi mystic, Ahmad al-Buni, and his absolutely extraordinary diagrams. Seriously, keep that question in your head. Because for al-Buni, that's exactly what these diagrams were. They weren't just charts you're supposed to understand, you know? They were actual tools designed to, transport you to another plane of existence. The idea was you could witness the secrets of the cosmos for yourself, firsthand. So just take a look at this thing. It's intricate, right? Kind of confusing, but also really beautiful. I mean, at first glance, you might think it's abstract art or maybe some complex astronomical chart. But this and others just like it was the heart of a powerful spiritual technology. So let's start to decode it. Okay, so to really get these diagrams, we got to understand the world they came from. Back in the 13th century, there was this powerful new discipline spreading through the Islamic world, and it was based on the idea that letters, letters of the alphabet, were the actual building blocks of reality. And this guy, Ahmad al-Buni, he was a huge deal. He was one of the key figures who brought all this esoteric knowledge, stuff that had been developed in places like Spain and North Africa, and introduced it to the Central Arab lands. And he was a master of this discipline, a discipline that promised to unlock the very secrets of creation itself. This discipline was called the science of letters, or lettrism, and the core idea, wow, it's absolutely profound. It suggests that the universe wasn't just created by God's speech, but that it's actually made of that speech. Think about that. Every single letter of the Arabic alphabet, every divine name, it holds a creative power, a key to the very structure of reality. And look, this wasn't just some abstract philosophical idea. No way. Lettrism had very real, practical uses. People used it to craft incredibly powerful prayers, to create talismans for things like protection and spiritual growth, and to develop ways to understand that unseen spiritual world, what they called the malakut. So, with all that in mind, let's circle back to that first diagram we saw. Now we can really start to crack its secrets, and it all begins with the very first letter of the alphabet. Okay, so this is the Aleph diagram. Now, Aleph is the first letter of the Arabic alphabet, and its numerical value is 1. For al-Buni, that was huge. It meant that everything, all of creation in all its crazy variety, exists in potential inside this one single letter. And this whole complex drawing, it's his attempt to map out that incredible mystery. And what's really fascinating is the way it's structured. You can see there are 2 vertical columns, right? The one on the right, that maps out the creation of the entire cosmos, flowing from the top down, from the divine intellect all the way to Earth. But the column on the left, that maps something completely different, the world of human spiritual life, from divine revelation down to everyday rituals like prayer and pilgrimage. So here's the kicker. Why have 2 columns for a letter that means 1? Well, that's the whole point. Al-Buni is showing that they are one and the same. He's revealing this fundamental secret. The structure of the entire universe, the macrocosm, is a perfect mirror of the structure of our spiritual lives, the microcosm. So the universe isn't just out there. Its blueprint is right here, inside us. And believe me, the stakes for understanding this were incredibly high. Al-Buni says it himself. Grasping this diagram wasn't just some intellectual exercise. It was a pathway to profound spiritual transformation. It was a way to, ascend to the rank of the saints, the people who inherit prophetic wisdom. But these diagrams weren't just for, sitting and thinking about quietly. Not at all. They were meant to be used, to be activated out in the real world. They were tools for a real, tangible transformation. Let's check out another one. This here is the diagram for the letter Ra. Al-Buni connects Ra to big concepts like ruh, which means spirit, and rahma, or mercy. The diagram itself, it's an image of the divine throne. This is a source from which God's life-giving spirit is supposed to flow, wrapping the whole cosmos in this womb-like circle of mercy. And this is where it gets super practical. Al-Buni actually gives specific instructions for how to turn this diagram into a powerful amulet. And it's an intense process, let me tell you. We're talking 8 days of fasting, maintaining a constant state of spiritual purity and focus, and then, very carefully, inscribing the diagram on parchment. The person doing it is physically acting out the whole creation process the diagram shows. But listen, this isn't about casting spells or anything like that. The effect is meant to be completely internal. The whole goal is to transform the person using it to kind of ease the sensory constraints of the material world and to fill their inner being, what's called the batin, with divine mercy. And that right there brings us to the real heart of the matter, the ultimate purpose of these incredible diagrams. It's not about what's on the page. It's about what the page can create inside of you. This is the key right here. Al-Buni's diagrams weren't just pretty pictures of his cosmology. They were designed to be vehicles, portals even, to allow the person using them to have a direct, visionary experience of the spiritual realities they represent. You could say that al-Buni was teaching a kind of spiritual graphicacy. It's a skill that's way beyond just reading the labels on a chart. It required a person to take the flat 2D image on the page and actively build it, visualize it, and bring it to life inside their own imagination, what the Sufis would call the heart's eye. And this is the perfect illustration of that idea. On the left, you see the diagram for the letter Tha, just as it looks in the manuscript. It's basically a simple circle with some writing. But that writing describes the incredibly complex three-dimensional vision it's supposed to trigger, this vision of an angelic peacock with 4 cosmic wings and its breast holding the secrets of the celestial spheres. I mean, wow. So you see, the diagram on the page is just the starting point. It's the key that turns the engine. The real event, the true visionary journey, that happens entirely in the mind of the person doing the work. The physical drawing is just a map to a vast inner landscape. And so, this 800-year-old practice really leaves us with a pretty compelling thought, doesn't it? If a simple circle with some words could be a portal to a whole visionary cosmos for a mystic back in the 13th century, then what unseen worlds might be just lying dormant, waiting to be discovered in the images that surround us every single day? All right, today we're putting on our detective hats. We're on the trail of a secret society, a group of thinkers from the 10th century. Their mission? To basically create a grand theory of everything. And their fate? Well, they just vanished from history. So let's jump right into the investigation. So the big question, right? The whole mystery really boils down to this. Who were the Ikhwan al-Safa, or as we know them in English, the Brethren of Purity? For 1,000 years, their identities have been one of the great unsolved puzzles of Islamic intellectual history. It's just wild. The only real clue they left behind was their incredible body of work. This huge collection of essays or epistles. You can think of it like a secret map to the entire universe. And it laid out this really coherent, really radical worldview that they truly believed held the key to salvation. Okay, so our investigation starts with the first clues they actually wanted us to find. The ones they hid right out in plain sight. You know, as you go through their massive work, you see this one phrase again and again. No, my brother. See, they weren't just writing a book. They were building a brotherhood. They were pulling you, the reader, into their inner circle, making you a part of their grand project. You don't just read their work. You kind of become one of them. And their name itself, Ikhwan al-Safa, that's a huge clue right there. It wasn't just some random cover name to stay hidden. Nope. It was basically their whole mission statement, signaling everything they were about. So where'd they get the name? It actually comes from this really old, famous collection of animal stories. In one of these fables, a group of doves gets caught in a hunter's net. The only way they get out is by working together, with help from their loyal friends, their pure brethren. You can see why they picked it, right? It was the perfect metaphor. The message was clear. You don't find salvation by yourself. It takes loyalty and teamwork. All right, so we know their name, but why? Why go through all the trouble of forming a secret society in the first place? Well, to figure that out, we've got to take a look at the world they were living in. We're in 10th century Basra, which is in modern-day southern Iraq, and let me tell you, this was not some sleepy town.
Basra was the place to be, a total melting pot of ideas, cultures, you name it. The whole city was just buzzing with energy. And I mean, just look at the timeline. This was a real golden age for thinkers in the Arab Muslim world. You had these absolute giants, like the philosopher al-Farabi and the poet al-Mutanabbi, just pushing knowledge forward. The Brethren were right in the middle of all this incredible intellectual energy, but they saw something wrong.
And this quote, "This is basically the smoking gun." This tells us exactly what they thought was wrong with the world. They felt that their faith, the pure divine truth, had gotten, well, messy. It was cluttered up with human errors and misunderstandings, and they believed it was their job to fix it, to purify it.
So you see, their whole project was basically a rescue mission. They thought the path to salvation was lost in all this confusion, so they needed to build a new one. And their idea for how to do it? It was pretty radical for the time. Use philosophy to save faith. Bring them together into a whole new synthesis of knowledge.
And man, their solution was ambitious. I mean, really ambitious. They decided they were going to create an encyclopedia of, well, pretty much everything.
50. They wrote 50 of these epistles. Just let that number sink in for a second. 50 separate treatises. And remember, they did all this anonymously. It was this massive undertaking designed to be the ultimate guide to every field of knowledge that existed at the time, from mathematics all the way to metaphysics. And they were super organized about it. They split everything into 4 big sections. They start with the foundations, right? The mathematical and natural sciences. Then you build up from there to the sciences of the soul and the mind, and finally, all the way up to theology and law. It was essentially a step-by-step curriculum for spiritual enlightenment. But here's the thing. At the heart of all this was an idea that was, let's just say, pretty radical, maybe even dangerous. And it's the real reason they had to keep their names a secret. Their ultimate goal was to merge 2 worlds that most people at the time thought should be kept totally separate: the rational, logical tradition of Greek philosophy and the divine truth of Islamic revelation. And they didn't hide it. They came right out and said it. They believed that true perfection, the purest understanding of God and the universe, could only be reached when these 2 streams of wisdom were joined together. For them, philosophy wasn't some threat to their faith. No way. It was the tool they needed to make their faith pure again. And what's so cool is how open-minded they were. They weren't just reading the Greeks. They were pulling in ideas from Persian traditions, from Indian traditions, all over the place. They had this core belief that all knowledge, no matter where it comes from, eventually leads to the same single universal truth. So, the big question is, what happened to them? Did this secret brotherhood of idealists actually succeed? Well, yeah, in a way. They absolutely nailed what they were trying to do. Their biggest win? Their secrecy. Think about it. For over 1,000 years, nobody has been able to definitively say who these guys were. They managed to completely erase themselves from the historical record. It's kind of amazing. But we do have one little tantalizing clue. A writer who was alive at the same time said he actually met them. He talks about them being this real group of buddies in Basra who were super into science, and he even drops a few names. It's the only peek we get behind the curtain, and it proves they were real people, not just a legend. And in the end, that was really their triumph, wasn't it? By making themselves anonymous, they forced the world to engage with their ideas, not with their personalities. Their names vanished, but their encyclopedic epistles survived, influencing thinkers across the Islamic world for centuries to come. Which kind of leaves us with one last thought to chew on. These guys, the Brethren of Purity, they went out of their way to make sure nobody knew their names. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? Can an idea actually be more powerful, more universal, when you have no idea who came up with it? We're going to unlock a world of secret knowledge, cosmic codes, and a book so powerful, so controversial, it was often banned. So let's dive right into the hidden world of Islamic theurgy. Okay, so our journey really kicks off with this one book. It's called the Shams Amaref, which translates to the Sun of Gnosis. Now, this thing was written way back in the 13th century, and let me tell you, it became one of the most famous and, yeah, infamous texts in the entire Islamic world. People saw it as a grimoire, a magician's manual, a source of some serious, immense power. So right off the bat, we're faced with this huge question, right? Is this thing a manual for, dark sorcery?
Or is it something else entirely, a guide to what you might call a divine science?
And understanding the difference here is absolutely crucial. So let's break it down. On one side, you've got theurgy. Think of this as harnessing divine energy. It's rooted in piety and orthodoxy, and the whole goal is to mystically align yourself with God. But then, on the other side, you have sorcery. This is totally different. This is about invoking spirits from, well, lower realms to get what you want in the world. And to theologians, this was straight up unbelief. So what's the real difference? It all boils down to two things: where the power comes from and what you plan to do with it.
So this divine science actually has a name. The proper Arabic term for it is simia. And look, this isn't about waving a wand and casting spells like you see in the movies. No. This is a deep intellectual discipline. It's all about understanding the secrets of God, the fundamental realities of creation itself. We're talking about a super high-level spiritual pursuit here. And right at the center of this secret world, at the very heart of simia, there's this one figure, a true master practitioner. And honestly, he's just as enigmatic as the science he taught. His name was al-Buni. He was born way back in the 12th century in a place called Buna, which is in modern-day Algeria. By the early 13th century, he'd become this renowned yet still very mysterious authority on all of these theurgic sciences. He eventually died in Cairo in 1225, but he left behind this body of work that was, well, let's just say it was profound and very controversial. But was he? See, here's where the story gets really fascinating. Scholars still debate this. Was Ahmad al-Buni actually a real single person? There's this theory called the Corpus Bunyanum, which basically suggests that al-Buni wasn't a man at all, but a name attached to a whole body of work written by anonymous authors. So was it one guy, or was it a whole secret school of thought? The mystery just keeps getting deeper. You know, whether al-Buni was one man or a whole movement, the idea that came from these writings is just breathtaking. The core belief was this: the universe has a source code. I mean, literally, like a divine operating system for reality itself. So what's this cosmic code made of? Well, the first component is what's known as the divine names of God. In Islamic tradition, there are the 99 names like the Merciful, the Creator. The idea here is that each one of these names isn't just a title, it represents a specific divine attribute, a unique force that's actively shaping the universe. Okay, so you have the code, but how do you unlock it? What are the keys? Get this, the keys are the letters of the Arabic alphabet. Al-Buni taught this whole discipline called the science of the secrets of the letters. He believed every single letter had its own numerical value, its own spiritual essence, and if you could combine the right letters with the right divine names, well, then you could actually interact with the very fabric of reality. And this wasn't just some random haphazard thing. There was a method, a clear step-by-step process. First, the practitioner, the theurgist, had to be in a state of ritual purity with a totally pure motive. Intention was everything. Step 2, they'd calculate. They do these complex calculations using the numerical values of the letters and the divine names to create super specific arrangements. And finally, step 3, they'd align themselves with cosmic forces. Yep, we're talking astrology and stuff, and then perform invocations to channel that divine energy. This was a system, a spiritual technology. Now, you might think all this high-level theory just stayed locked away in dusty old books, but that's not the case at all. It actually created what scholars call a material culture. These divine formulas were literally inscribed onto magic bowls for healing, woven into the fabric of talismanic shirts to protect the wearer. They were even mass-produced on paper amulets and engraved on pendants and rings. This was high science being translated into real, tangible objects that everyday people could use. So you have to wonder, right? If this stuff was so powerful, why isn't it more widely known? Well, this quote really gets to the heart of it. The occult is doubly occult. It is a hidden knowledge of hidden truths. The people who had this knowledge, they guarded it very, very carefully. They called it the pearl of great price. And it makes sense, doesn't it? You don't just go around sharing the universe's source code with anyone and everyone. And this actually brings us to a really powerful way to think about all this, and it comes from science fiction writer Arthur C. Clarke. It's his famous third law: any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Just think about that for a second. To an outsider, someone who doesn't understand the underlying system, what these practitioners were doing would look exactly like magic. But to the person who knew the code, it wasn't magic, it was technology. And that really leaves us with one final, pretty mind-bending question to chew on. You know, in our modern world, we tend to draw a pretty hard line between prayer, which we see as a plea, a hope, and power, which we see as a direct action. But what if the practitioners of Simia didn't see that line at all? What if, for them, the real difference between prayer and power wasn't about faith or about chance, but was simply about knowledge, the knowledge of the universe's divine source code?
Okay, picture this. It's the year 1502. You get a chance to peek into the private library of one of the most powerful men in the world, the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid II. So what do you think he's reading? You'd probably guess history, poetry, religious texts, and you'd be right. But he was also reading something, well, something way more mysterious. And the answer, which we found in his library's inventory, it reveals a completely different kind of power.
You see, the official inventory of his palace library actually survives to this day. And when historians started digging into it, they found an entire section that raises this incredible question. What kind of secret knowledge was considered essential for a 15th century ruler? And believe me, the answer is not what you'd expect.
So forget your standard books on statecraft. The Sultan's collection was an absolute treasure trove of what we would now call the occult sciences. I mean, we're talking about dream interpretation, alchemy, how to create talismans, summoning spirits, and even this super complex form of political and end-of-the-world prediction called Jaffrey. This wasn't some fringe hobby, you know? This was part of the imperial toolkit.
Now, to really get why a powerful sultan would have a library packed with these kinds of texts, we have to kind of shift our perspective. We have to try and see the universe the way they did. And it was a fundamentally different and, honestly, a much more enchanted world.
So starting around the 12th century, this new vision of the cosmos really took hold. Scholars call it the new cosmological imaginary, and the basic idea is this. Forget thinking about the universe as just a bunch of separate things. Instead, imagine it's all one single living organism, where everything flows from a divine source and is connected by all these invisible threads.
Yeah, the best way to think about it is like a vast, interconnected web. It was sometimes called the Great Chain of Being. The idea was that everything, from the highest spiritual plane all the way down to a simple rock on the ground, was linked together.
And this wasn't just some philosophical idea, it was intensely practical. Stars, plants, numbers, even the letters of the alphabet. They weren't just isolated things. They had what were called sympathetic or antipathetic relationships. They could attract or repel each other. So the occult sciences, they weren't superstition. They were basically the instruction manual for how to operate within this hidden web. And with this growing belief that the end times were just around the corner, mastering this knowledge was seen as absolutely crucial.
But hold on a second. A lot of these ideas came from pre-Islamic or so-called pagan thought. So how did they become not just okay, but essential for a Muslim ruler? Well, that took another huge intellectual shift when that completely redefined what wisdom even meant.
Back in the classical era, most thinkers drew a really sharp line between Islamic and non-Islamic knowledge. But then this new way of thinking came along, something one scholar calls Platonic Orientalism, and it goes like this. The idea was that ancient sages, people like Hermes, Plato, Pythagoras, they were almost like prophets who had received little pieces of the same divine truth. So their supposedly pagan ideas weren't wrong, they were just early glimpses of the ultimate truth that was later perfected in the Qur'an.
And the result of this shift was just profound. It created a totally legitimate esoteric tradition inside of Islam that could trace its roots all the way back to these ancient sages. All of a sudden, this pagan wisdom wasn't foreign anymore. It was part of a universal secret history of divine knowledge.
And the best example of this is a practice called lettrism. It's a really complex science based on the secret power of letters and numbers. And it wasn't seen as just, magic. It was elevated to the status of a divinely approved science of the saints. People saw it as a way to understand the very building blocks of creation itself, that deep relationship between God's speech and reality.
So, how did it actually work? Well, to put it simply, a letrist would take the divine names of God, convert them into their numerical values, and then arrange those numbers into mathematical magic squares. Then, using very precise astrological timing, they could create powerful talismans that were designed to influence the world. It was this incredible blend of math, mysticism, and astrology.
And the proof of just how important this was is right there in the Sultan's library inventory. The librarian, a guy named Atufi, he didn't file the books on lettrism under magic or anything like that. Nope. He put them right alongside the most cherished religious sciences, like commentaries on the Qur'an. That tells you everything you need to know about how sacred this knowledge had become.
Okay, so we've got this interconnected universe and all this sanctified ancient wisdom. But how does a sultan actually use any of this stuff? This is where all that cosmic theory becomes a very practical, hands-on toolkit for running an empire.
Seriously, this was not abstract philosophy. Geomancy, which is a kind of divination using sand, was used to create detailed yearly forecasts for the entire empire. That complex science, Jafar, was used to try and predict the outcomes of battles. Physiognomy, the art of judging someone's character from their face, was a tool for sizing up foreign diplomats or even his own advisors. And of course, astrology had a hand in pretty much every major decision of the state.
And get this, even the section in the inventory that's labeled sihr, a word we translate as magic or sorcery, and one that often sounds negative, most of the books in that section were about one specific thing, a divination method to predict who would win a battle based on the numerical value of the rulers' names. So the crucial point here is that even what they called magic was really a tool of military intelligence.
And all of this brings us to the final and maybe the most mind-bending part of the Sultan's library, because it really forces us to completely throw out our modern ideas of what's science and what's magic. Because tucked away in that same occult section of the library, you find something that seems totally out of place. Technical manuals on how to build incredible automata. These are self-operating machines, and complex mechanical clocks. You know, stuff we would absolutely call engineering or applied math.
But the librarian filed these engineering manuals right next to books on making astral talismans and the secrets of alchemy. Why? I mean, what on earth could a mechanical clock have in common with turning lead into gold?
Well, the answer lies in a concept they had called the thaumaturgic arts, which comes from Greek and basically just means wonder-producing arts. From their point of view, building a clock and creating a talisman were two sides of the same coin. Both were ways of mastering the hidden rules of God's creation. Whether you were messing with gears and springs or planetary influences, you were tapping into the secret source code of the universe. And the result, in both cases, was wonder.
And that right there is the key takeaway. For Sultan Bayezid and his librarian, the word occult didn't mean evil or forbidden or anything spooky. It just meant hidden. The occult sciences were the arts of understanding and working with the hidden principles that make the universe tick, whether those principles showed up on the stars, in a chemical reaction, or in the gears of a clock.
Which leaves us with a pretty big final thought. You know, we look back and see how they drew the lines between science, magic, and religion, and it seems strange to us. But it makes you wonder, how are we drawing those lines today? What kinds of knowledge are we pushing to the side, calling illegitimate, just because they don't fit into our neat little boxes?
Okay, so today we're going to crack open a real historical mystery. It's all centered around this one book, a 400-year-old book, actually. And trust me, it's a wild story, packed with scholarship, high-stakes politics, and a publishing controversy that just refused to die for centuries. So yeah, let's dive right in. So picture this. It's 1547. We're in Venice, which at the time was the print capital of the world. I mean, it was buzzing. And out of nowhere, this groundbreaking book shows up, l'Alcorano di Macometto. And this was a huge deal. It was the very first printed translation of the Quran into a modern European language, in this case, Italian. And man, it looked amazing. It felt important, like it held the key to understanding the biggest superpower of the era, the Ottoman Empire. But then, fast forward a few decades, one of the absolute rock stars of Renaissance scholarship, a guy named Joseph Justus Scaliger, finally gets his hands on a copy. And he'd been looking for this thing everywhere. You can imagine his excitement, right? Well, this was his verdict. Our treasure is all turned to coal. Ouch. A treasure turned into worthless coal. So what on earth happened?
Right. What went so horribly wrong here? How did this celebrated book get slammed as a complete fake almost right out of the gate? Let's, investigate the crime.
Okay, to really get why Scaliger was so ticked off, you've got to put yourself in his shoes. This guy was a world-class linguist. He thought he was getting the real deal, a scholarly tool that would let him study the original Arabic. But what he got, well, it was basically a copy of a copy, a translation of a much older Latin version from the 12th century. For a scholar like him, it was just a total bust, a huge letdown.
And here's the thing. Scaliger's takedown wasn't just some random bad review. Oh no. It was more like the opening argument in a trial that would drag on for, wait for it, 400 years.
I mean, just look at this who's who of scholars lining up to take a swing. For centuries, the biggest names in Europe just piled on. The verdict was always the same: imposter, absurd, inaccurate, plagiarism. It was a total pile-on. The book's reputation was completely trashed, sealed as this worthless fraud. And every century that passed, that case file just got thicker and thicker. So the case is closed, right? Open and shut. But what if it's not? What if all these brilliant minds for 400 years were asking the completely wrong questions? What if they were judging this book for being something it never, ever tried to be in the first place? To get to the bottom of this, we've got to get out of the dusty, quiet library. We need to go back to the scene of the so-called crime. 1540s Venice, the city where this whole thing started. Yeah, and you can just forget any idea of a quiet little academic town. We're talking about 16th century Venice. This place was the absolute nerve center of Europe. It was chaotic, politically explosive, a crossroads teeming with spies, religious rebels, merchants, diplomats, you name it. And they were all buzzing around the most powerful publishing industry on the entire continent. Okay, so keeping that scene in mind, let's figure out the real motive here. Why would somebody make this book in that kind of place? And this right here is the key to the whole mystery. It's all about expectations versus reality. See, the scholars, the schologers of the world, they wanted it deeply academic, literal translation for their studies. But the publisher, a guy named Andrea Arrivabene, he wasn't making a textbook. He was making a commercial product. It was meant to be a handy, maybe even pocket-sized, guide to Islam, a history, and a political briefing, all for a totally different kind of customer. And oh yeah, it was deeply political. Get this, the book was dedicated to the French ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. This guy was a major player in this really high-stakes military alliance between France and the Ottomans. Why? Because they both had the same enemy, the super powerful Habsburgs. So this little book, it was a piece on a giant geopolitical chessboard. So who was this book really for? It wasn't for academics sitting in a library. No. It was for people on the move. We're talking diplomats and merchants heading to Istanbul, political and religious exiles looking for a safe haven, and just curious Europeans who wanted to understand the biggest superpower of their time. They all needed practical info, not a dense scholarly text. Okay, so if this book wasn't just a simple fraud, then who is the person who actually put this whole complex, misunderstood thing together? It's time to identify our culprit. You know, for more than 450 years, nobody knew who translated it. It was a total mystery. But recent research has finally put a name to this ghost, Giovanni Battista Castorado. And he wasn't some hack. He was a respected Dante scholar, an editor, and a historian. And the plot thickens. Castorado had this short but brilliant literary career. We're talking 5 intense years. But then, right after this book comes out, poof, he vanishes from the literary scene completely. He goes back to his tiny hometown and basically stays silent for 40 years. What in the world happened to him? All right, we've got the context, we've got the motive, and we've even got our man. So now it's time to go back to that central charge and deliver a final verdict. So after all that, after 4 centuries of everyone calling it a fraud, was it? Let's ask that one last time. And the answer, when you look at all the evidence, is no, it wasn't a fraud. That big claim on the title page, newly translated from Arabic, that wasn't some kind of scholarly guarantee. You have to remember, this was the Wild West of Venetian publishing. It was a super competitive market. That phrase was basically just marketing. Think of it like seeing new and improved on a box today. It was designed to sell books to the public, not to fool a handful of elite linguists. So here's the real takeaway. The Alcorano di Macometto tells us way less about the Quran itself and a whole lot more about the wild, turbulent world it came from. We're talking Renaissance politics, major religious shifts, and the birth of the modern publishing industry. It was a diplomatic tool, a popular history, and a commercial product, all rolled into one incredible package. And that really leaves us with a bigger question, doesn't it? This whole story is a great reminder to look past easy labels like fake or plagiarism. It pushes us to understand historical things in their own world, not ours. You know, it makes you wonder, how many other so-called frauds of history are out there, just waiting for us to finally understand their real story? Okay, when I say the word magic, what pops into your head? Probably wizards, fantasy novels, maybe just simple superstition, right? But what if I told you that for hundreds of years, in one of the most brilliant civilizations on Earth, what we'd call magic was actually a science, a legitimate, super sophisticated branch of science? And that's really the heart of what we're digging into today. Was this stuff, what we're calling Islamicate magic, just a bunch of old folklore? Superstition? Or was there something more going on? Something way more complex, something that looked a lot like a real systematic science. All right, so first things first, we've got to get the language right. You see, the word magic comes with a ton of modern baggage. People back then didn't even use it. They had their own term, al-ulum al-khafiya, that literally translates to the hidden sciences. Sometimes they'd call them the unusual sciences, or the recondite sciences. And that small change in wording, it's a huge deal. It takes this whole conversation out of the world of fantasy and puts it right where it belongs, in the world of serious, intellectual inquiry. And look, we have to be super clear about another thing. When you hear the word occult, you might think of occultism, right? That specific Western movement from the 1800s and 1900s. We need to just set that aside. That is not what this is about. The occult sciences in the Islamicate world, we're talking about a way older, deeply established tradition of knowledge that was woven right into the fabric of philosophy and science for centuries.
Okay, so what was the theory? How did this whole system of thought actually work? Let's peel back the layers and look at the cosmic blueprint they were using.
So get ready for this, because this is the part that just blows most of our modern assumptions out of the water. These hidden sciences weren't some rogue, shady practices happening in dark alleys. No way. They were formally classified systems of knowledge. They had a seat at the table, right alongside things like natural science and mathematics. They were seen as a totally legitimate part of the whole scientific project.
And you want proof? Look no further than one of the greatest minds in history, Ibn Sina, or Avicenna as he's known in the West. He basically created a map for all of human knowledge, which he called hikmah, or wisdom. So he divides this wisdom into different levels: higher sciences, middle sciences, lower sciences. And then down in the lower, or natural sciences, he makes another split: primary and secondary fields. And guess what he puts in that secondary category? You got it. Talismans, alchemy, astrology, dream interpretation. It's right there in black and white. These weren't fringe ideas. They had a specific logical address in the grand structure of knowledge.
And this stuff could get incredibly deep and complex. I mean, take ilm al-huruf, the science of letters. The idea here is just fascinating. It wasn't that the letters of the Arabic alphabet were just symbols for sounds. No, the theory was that they were the actual building blocks of reality, like the source code of the universe. So if you could understand their secret meanings, their numerical values, their hidden power, well, that was considered a master science. It was a key to unlocking the secrets of everything, from the physical world to the metaphysical one.
Okay, so that's the big picture theory. It's pretty mind-bending, right? But what did this look like on the ground, in the real world? Let's shift gears now and talk about the practice. How this knowledge was turned into actual, tangible things, the real tools of power. And this is so important. If you really want to get a handle on these sciences, reading the old books is only half the story. You have to look at the stuff they made, the artifacts. Because these objects, these things you can hold, that's where these occult technologies came to life. It's where the rubber met the road. Let me give you a couple of just incredible examples. Picture this: a suit of chainmail from 17th century India. At first glance, okay, it's armor. It's meant to stop a sword. But when you get up close, you see that every single one of its thousands of little iron rings has a prayer stamped on it. All of a sudden, it's not just a piece of military gear anymore. It's become a wearable talisman. It's a perfect blend of physical defense and spiritual power. Or check this out, a 16th century Ottoman saber. I mean, it's a stunning weapon for sure, but look at the blade. It is covered intricately with verses from the Qur'an. And that was not just for decoration. The whole point was to give the person holding it divine protection to help them win in battle. You could almost call it weaponized piety. And this wasn't just in one place. These ideas and practices spread all across the Islamicate world, and they'd mix with local traditions. For example, look at this royal banner from 18th century Java. You see this powerful, mystical lion, but then you realize the entire lion is made out of incredibly skillful Arabic calligraphy. It's just this amazing fusion of art, royal power, and spiritual protection, all in one object. But here's a really cool twist. These things weren't like passive good luck charms. Their power wasn't just on all the time. The old texts are pretty clear about this. For a talismanic sword or a suit of armor to work, it depended on the person using it. You had to actively engage with it. You had to understand the formulas, believe in them, and in doing so, you would activate its power. It was this cool symbiotic relationship between the person and the object. Okay, so if this stuff was so mainstream, so sophisticated, what happened, right? Why do we now think of it as fringe or just plain superstitious? Well, that's where we get to this huge shift in how people thought about knowledge and how these sciences ended up getting pushed to the margins. It was basically a perfect storm of a few big things happening at once. In Europe, you have the Enlightenment starting in the 18th century, which really created this hard line between science and superstition. At the same time, you had powerful reform movements within the Islamic world that wanted to purify the faith and get rid of practices they saw as superstitious. Fast forward to the early 20th century, and this all leads to actual legal changes. In some places, these ancient professions were literally outlawed. And when you put the two views side by side, the contrast is just stark. The historical view, these sciences were part of hikmah, part of wisdom, a totally valid way to try and understand the universe. The modern view, mostly it's just dismissed. It's seen as irrational, backwards, kind of like an embarrassing chapter of history we should probably just forget about. So why bother digging all this up? Why does this matter today? Because, and this is the really interesting part, looking at this stuff forces us to rethink what rationality even means. And it's more relevant than you might think. Here's the takeaway. At the end of the day, when we just write off these hidden sciences as superstition, we're missing the point. We're not just getting magic wrong, we are fundamentally misunderstanding centuries of intellectual history, culture, and even politics in the Islamicate world. By digging into it, we're forced to question our own, sometimes really narrow modern ideas about what counts as science and what it even means to be rational. So I'll leave you with this to think about. If what we consider a real science can change so much over time, what hidden sciences might we be ignoring right now? What important ways of knowing are we overlooking today just because they don't quite fit into our 21st century box? So, imagine a courtroom where all of humanity is on trial. That's exactly what we're going to dive into today. One of the most incredible lawsuits ever thought up, a case that's basically been waiting 1,000 years for us to pay attention. What we're looking at here is a story called The Case of the Animals versus Man Before the King of the Jinn. It's a philosophical fable written over a millennium ago, but honestly, it feels like it could have been written yesterday. It's just shockingly relevant. And the whole story, the entire thing, really just hangs on this one single radical question. What if the animal kingdom finally got fed up with us and decided, you know what? We'll see you in court. And this isn't just some abstract thought experiment. No. The fable plays this whole scenario out in amazing detail, creating a trial that puts every last one of us in the defendant's chair. Okay, so let's set the scene, because let me tell you, this is no ordinary courtroom. The setting alone tells you just how big of a deal this whole confrontation is. So who's the judge? Well, it's not a human. It's a supernatural and supposedly totally impartial being, Biwar-Asp the Wise, the king of the jinn. For anyone who doesn't know, jinn are these powerful, intelligent spirits from Islamic mythology. So right away, you see that human authority is just completely taken out of the picture. And who's on trial? Well, that would be all of us. The fable puts the whole of humanity, every culture, every country, every belief system, all together as the defendants. And the ones bringing the charges? I mean, this scale is just staggering. This isn't just a couple of angry animals. We're talking everyone, from the tiniest bug to the biggest whale. The entire animal kingdom has banded together to bring this case against us. So you have to be wondering, who on earth came up with something so wild, so ahead of its time, 1,000 years ago? And why did they decide to keep their names a secret? Well, the authors were this really mysterious group of intellectuals known as the Brethren of Purity. They were a secret society of thinkers operating out of 10th century Basra and Baghdad, right in the heart of the Islamic Golden Age, a time of incredible discovery. And they believed that knowledge, true knowledge, was the key to salvation. What's so fascinating is what they were trying to do. They wanted to create a kind of grand, unified theory of truth, and they pulled from everywhere they could. I mean, look at this list. The Qur'an, Greek philosophy, Persian traditions. They believed there was truth in every religion and every philosophy, and their goal was to bring it all together, to rise above all the bitter arguments of their time.
Okay, so the court is in session. The trial begins, and for the first time ever, the animals get their say, a chance to air all their grievances against their human masters.
So what's their opening argument? What's the main charge they lay right at humanity's feet? It starts with this really raw, emotional accusation of cruelty and just deep ingratitude. The rabbit steps up to speak and describes how humans take their milk, their wool, their labor, but in the end, they repay all that service with a knife, unfeeling and unremembering any of the good they ever received.
And look, it goes way beyond just physical violence. The animals lay out this whole systematic case of human exploitation. They talk about being worked to the bone, having their babies stolen from them, being forced to fight in human wars, and watching their homes get destroyed as humans spread across the entire planet. They even say we've corrupted noble creatures like dogs and cats, turning them into these sycophantic dependents. But here's where things get really interesting. The case pivots. It moves from just a list of complaints to this incredibly deep philosophical and ecological argument that really attacks the whole idea of human superiority. It all boils down to this fundamental clash of worldviews. Humans, we tend to operate under the assumption that nature exists for us, that it's ours to own and control. But the fable flips that script completely. The animals argue that this is just a dangerous fantasy. Man isn't separate from nature, he's just another part of it, and he has to follow the same rules as everybody else. And you know, for a text that's 1,000 years old, their grasp of ecology is just incredible. The animals explain that even the most powerful human is just a single link in this giant cycle. It's like they're saying, hey, you might think you're at the top of the food chain, but that's just temporary. In the end, even you will get eaten by the smallest creatures, and your body will go back to the earth that feeds us all. And that was their ultimate mic drop moment. Every single creature, from a tiny gnat to a snake, was created for its own reason, with its own purpose and its own value. It's human arrogance, they argue, that makes us blind to this simple truth, a concept that, wow, sounds like it could have been written yesterday by an environmentalist or an animal rights activist. All right, so after all that testimony, after all the arguments back and forth, how did the king of the jinn rule? What was the verdict in this absolutely monumental case? And what does it really tell us today? So the judge doesn't just side with the animals or condemn humanity outright. It's much more clever than that. The verdict basically says that our dominion over the earth isn't some God-given right we earned. It's a test of our potential for justice and for mercy. So the final judgment is kind of left up to us. It all hinges on our actions. The fable suggests humanity has these two extremes inside of us. We can be like noble angels, or we can be like destructive devils. Our right to be in charge isn't guaranteed. It's something we have to earn, every single day. So these thinkers put us on trial 1,000 years ago, and it leaves you with this one big question. If that same court were held today, and we had to answer the animals' charges of cruelty, of arrogance, of destroying the planet, what would our defense be? And honestly, would it be good enough? Have you ever heard of a book that's so powerful, so full of secrets, that for centuries people have been both in awe of it and, well, terrified on it? Today, we're going to unlock one of the most mysterious texts in the entire world, the Shams al-Ma'arif. Okay, let's just dive right in. What you're looking at here is a title page from the book itself. For almost 1,000 years, people have whispered that its pages hold the keys to cosmic power, like a guide to manipulating the very fabric of reality. So, what is this legendary, often forbidden book? Let's start peeling back the layers of this mystery. Well, at its core, the Shams al-Ma'arif is what you call a grimoire, which is basically a textbook for magic. But we're not just talking about a collection of simple spells. Oh no. This is an incredibly intricate manual that details how to create talismans, how to summon spirits, and how to harness astrological energies. And that combination of the sacred and the arcane, that's exactly why it's viewed with such a mix of awe and, you know, a little bit of fear. But to really understand the book, we have to get inside the head of the person who created it. So, who was this mystic behind all the magic? The author's name was Ahmad al-Buni.
He lived way back in the 13th century. And here's the thing, he wasn't some shadowy sorcerer hiding in a cave. Al-Buni was a highly respected Sufi mystic, and get this, a brilliant mathematician. His life's work was all about studying the hidden, esoteric properties of the divine names and the letters of the Arabic alphabet, which he believed held just immense spiritual power. Okay, now to really get what makes this book tick, we have to understand its core philosophy. It all comes down to the unbelievable energy that's believed to be locked away inside the letters themselves. This whole philosophy is called Ilm al-Huruf, which translates to the science of letters. It's this foundational idea that the 28 letters of the Arabic alphabet aren't just symbols for sounds. No, they are the fundamental building blocks of creation itself. Think of it this way. Each letter has a numerical value and a cosmic connection, basically forming the divine source code of the entire universe. Now, what's so cool about what you're seeing here is that it shows the book's two sides perfectly. On the left, you've got these pages of really dense philosophical instructions, the theory. And then on the right, you see how that theory gets put into practice. This incredibly complex magic square, a talisman, designed by combining letters and numbers exactly according to al-Buni's system. It's the why and the how, right next to each other. So let's get into the practical side of things and see how this science was actually used to create these cosmic codes and talismans. The first thing you have to understand is that timing was absolutely crucial. This celestial map from the book, it wasn't just for decoration. It was a calculator used to figure out the perfect astrological moment for a ritual. The idea was that the cosmos had to be perfectly aligned, kind of like tuning a radio to exactly the right frequency before any real power could be channeled. And this is the physical container for all that power, a talisman. If you look closely, you can see it's this carefully constructed diagram. If the letters are the software, this right here is the hardware. It combines specific divine names, numerical squares, and symbols, all designed to house and direct a particular cosmic energy toward a very specific goal, whether that was for protection or influence or even knowledge. And if you thought that was detailed, check this out. This table shows the incredible level of precision they were working with. It assigned specific letters to different hours of the day and night, so it wasn't enough to just have the right time of year or the right ingredients. You had to act at the exact correct moment. According to al-Buni, every single second is connected to the divine alphabet, so you had to be absolutely accurate to get it right. So to make this a little clearer, here's a simplified peek at the system. Each Arabic letter, like alif or ba, has its own numerical value. Simple enough, right? But it doesn't stop there. Each one is also linked to a cosmic association, like an element or a planet. Al-Buni basically created this massive, intricate web of connections, a complete system for mapping all of reality. So, with all this incredible complexity, what was the endgame? Was it really just about casting spells, or was there something much deeper going on? And that brings us right back to the book's title. The title itself, The Sun of Gnosis, tells you everything you need to know about its true purpose. See, Gnosis isn't just knowledge, like knowing facts. It's a deep, intuitive understanding of spiritual truths. So the goal wasn't just magic for magic's sake. Magic was the tool you used to achieve a profound understanding of the divine order of the universe. And this, right here, is the most important takeaway. The Shams al-Ma'arif is built on this radical idea that the universe isn't just a collection of random chaotic events. Instead, it's a perfectly ordered, incredibly complex, coded text written by God. And by mastering the science of letters, a person could learn not just to read this divine text, but to understand its very grammar. So even after 800 years, the central idea of this mysterious grimoire is just as compelling as it ever was. It leaves us with a pretty fascinating question to think about, doesn't it? What if everything around us, from the stars in the sky to our own existence, is all part of a divine language, a cosmic text just waiting for someone to come along and finally read it? Let's jump back to the 13th century and meet an absolutely fascinating and, let's be honest, pretty puzzling figure, Ahmad al-Buni. Now, this is a guy who lived at a really unique crossroads where mysticism, science, and yeah, even magic all intertwined to create this breathtaking system of thought. And this, right here, is the big question that kind of hangs over his entire legacy. How could one man be so revered as a Sufi saint that his tomb became a site of pilgrimage, while at the same time he's being called a heretic and a sorcerer by major theologians like Ibn Taymiyyah? We're going to unpack that mystery.
So, al-Buni was a Sufi master from North Africa who later settled in Cairo, and he wrote these incredibly detailed, dense books on what he called the occult sciences. But here's the kicker. These books were never meant for you and me. They were secret, designed for a small, initiated circle of his own students. And yet, despite that secrecy, their influence just exploded across the centuries.
Okay, so to really get a handle on al-Buni's universe and all the controversy around it, we first have to understand his most essential tool, the secret science of letters. And no, we're not talking about grammar or poetry here. We're talking about the very code of creation itself. This science is called letterism, or ilm al-huruf in Arabic, and the core idea, it is absolutely stunning. It suggests that the letters of the Arabic alphabet and the divine names of God they spell out aren't just symbols for sounds. No, they are the prima materia, the primordial stuff that reality itself is built from. Now, you might be thinking, hey, a sacred alphabet that structures the universe? That sounds kind of familiar. And you'd be right. A really great comparison is Jewish Kabbalah, which was actually developing around the same time. While Kabbalah is all about the Hebrew alphabet, al-Buni's letterism is all about the Arabic one. But they both share this profound vision that the alphabet is the master key to understanding the hidden architecture of God and the cosmos. This quote just nails the central idea. For people like al-Buni, the universe and the holy book, the Qur'an, they aren't two separate things. They are two different expressions of the exact same phenomenon, God's creative speech. It's like the universe is a text, and the text is a universe. So if the universe is really made of divine speech, what does that actually look like? How did al-Buni go about mapping this incredible cosmos? Let's take a look at his model. All right, take a look. At first glance, this might seem like a standard map of the universe from that time, with Earth in the middle. But look closer. Notice how every single sphere, from the divine throne way out at the edge, all the way down to the elements, is assigned specific letters of the Arabic alphabet. This isn't just an astronomy chart, it's a diagram of how God's speech radiates outward to form all of reality. Al-Buni breaks down this whole creation process into 4 stages, which is kind of like a Neoplatonic cascade. It all starts with the first world of invention, pure divine intellect. And from there, reality just emanates outward, flowing through the divine pen, the world's soul, and finally landing in the second world of origination, which is where we are, with the planets, the elements, and the material world. And here's the part that you really have to get. The letters aren't just assigned to these levels like labels on a map. Al-Buni uses the word sown. They are literally planted inside every layer of creation. So a letter isn't just a mark on a page. It's an active, you might even say angelic force that's present in everything, from the highest spiritual plane right down to a rock on the ground. Okay, this is where things get really wild. This brings us to al-Buni's most radical, most secret teaching. Because if letters are what structure the cosmos, he believed the regular old alphabet was only telling part of the story. He was about to completely rewire the ancient rules of astrology. And here's the little discrepancy that unlocks the whole secret. The Arabic alphabet has 28 letters. That's a fact. But al-Buni, in his secret texts, insists that the true cosmic alphabet, the one that governs everything, has 48 letters. So where did those extra 20 letters come from? 48. That's the number. He claimed this was the true number of forces, or letters, that shape all of reality. And he broke them down into 3 very distinct tiers. His system is it's beautiful in its symmetry. The 48 letters are split into 3 groups. First, you have 7 luciform or light-based letters, and they function like the planets. Then there are 12 spiritual letters which act as the zodiac, and finally, you've got 29 corporeal letters, the physical alphabet plus 1, which make up the material world. He basically just reskinned the entire astrological system onto this new secret framework. So what were these 7 luciform letters? Well, get this. It was a code. Al-Buni gave a series of numbers that, if you translate them using a system called Abjad numerology, spell out the Arabic phrase bi'al sifat, which means by means of the attributes. The 7 planets weren't planets at all. They were secretly the 7 primary names or attributes of God, like the all-knowing and the all-powerful.
And the second secret is just as profound. Those 12 spiritual letters that took the place of the zodiac, yeah, they weren't letters either. They were the 12 faculties of human consciousness: hearing, sight, touch, imagination, reason. You get the idea. The zodiac wasn't out there in the sky. For al-Buni, it was in here, inside the human mind.
So what does this all mean? I mean, if the planets are actually God's attributes, and the zodiac is actually our own consciousness, that completely flips the script on humanity's role in the cosmos. We are no longer just these passive things getting zapped by cosmic forces. We are absolutely central to how the whole system works. This was al-Buni's most revolutionary idea. In traditional astrology, the planets' rays hit the Earth directly. But in al-Buni's system, the divine attributes, his planets, cannot influence the material world directly. They must pass through the filter of human faculties, his zodiac. Humanity becomes this absolutely essential bridge between the divine and the material world.
But here's the twist. Not all human filters are the same. Al-Buni argued that for most of us, our spiritual faculties are like a radio receiver that's just full of static. But saints, through intense spiritual practice, they've purified their faculties. They've become perfect, crystal clear channels. They are the ones who can purely transmit God's creative power into the world, which gives a kind of scientific explanation for their miracles.
And this wasn't just abstract theory, it had very practical applications. For instance, to create a talisman for stability, you needed the right astrological timing. Sure, the moon aligned with Jupiter, but that wasn't enough. The person making the talisman had to be in a state of ritual purity, fasting, and deep inner peace. They had to combine the physical act with the spiritual act of chanting God's name. The state of the operator was just as crucial as the state of the stars. Now, it's really important to see that al-Buni's work didn't just pop up out of nowhere. He was part of a much bigger intellectual current that was sweeping across the Mediterranean, a whole movement that was trying to uncover the hidden rules of reality. The late 12th and early 13th centuries were truly an age of esotericism. You've got Jewish thinkers like Abraham ibn Ezra and Maimonides, and fellow Sufi masters like the great Ibn al-Arabi, all digging into the hidden links between scripture, cosmology, and human power. It was this amazing cross-faith wave of thought, with ideas flowing back and forth between Muslim and Jewish intellectual circles. So to wrap it all up, al-Buni wasn't trying to debunk or reject astrology. He was doing something way more ambitious. He was claiming to unveil its true inner meaning. His system took astrology and folded it into this vast, incredibly sophisticated Islamic cosmology, basically arguing that the stars were just the outer clothing for a much deeper reality, woven from the very speech of God.
And all this leaves us with a final, really challenging thought. Al-Buni's universe just doesn't care about our neat little modern categories. His work is a religious text, a scientific paper on causation, and a practical magic manual all at the same time. And that makes you ask a pretty fundamental question. Where do we draw the line between these things? Or, in a world like his, does that line even exist at all?
Today, we're going to dive into a fascinating world where faith, science, and the mystical all kind of collide. And we're going to explore it all through the work of one really influential historical figure, al-Buni.
But first, just take a look at this. What are we even seeing here? Is it some kind of ancient star chart? A really complex math problem? Or maybe it's a tool, something designed to channel spiritual power? And that really gets to the heart of what we're talking about today. What do you even call a system that uses divine names in these intricate diagrams to find protection or healing? Is it magic? Is it science? Or is it something else completely? Let's try and unpack that.
Okay, so let's start with that mysterious symbol. What is it? And how do we even begin to know what it all means?
Well, our guide for this whole journey is actually a piece of modern scholarship, a PhD dissertation from 2005. And this is so important because it shows that these ancient practices aren't just some dusty old relics. Nope, they're actually serious subjects of academic study today, helping us understand history, faith, and what people believe.
So who was the mind behind these incredibly complex systems? It's time to meet the man at the center of this entire world. His full name was Ahmad ibn Ali al-Buni. He was a scholar, a writer,
And his work, well, it would become hugely influential for centuries to come. And this number right here, 1225, this gives us the time frame we're talking about. That's the year al-Buni died. So that places him right in the heart of the medieval Islamic world, which was, a period of absolutely incredible intellectual and spiritual growth.
All right, so now we get to that big, tricky question we started with. Was what al-Buni did, was it religion or was it magic? As it turns out, the answer is a little more complicated than a simple yes or no.
To really get what he was doing, we need to understand this key term, esotericism. It's basically the idea that some knowledge isn't for everybody. It's meant for a select few, an inner circle. For al-Buni and others like him, this was all about knowing precisely how to use divine names, letters, and symbols to create real-world effects.
Now this is where it gets really interesting, because you can see the distinction pretty clearly here. On one hand, you've got public religion. That's the prayers, the rituals, the beliefs that are shared by the whole community. But on the other hand, you have these esoteric practices. These were often very individual, very personal rituals that were aimed at specific needs, like creating a talisman for your own protection or for healing. So how did these practices actually work? Let's take a look at how these big ideas were actually applied to create rituals for healing and for protection.
And here we are, back at our symbol. But now we get it on a much deeper level. This isn't just a random jumble of lines and text. Every single element, the Arabic letters, the divine names, the numbers set up in those grids, every part was believed to hold a specific power. The whole goal was to combine them in just the right way to create a very specific spiritual effect.
So, the crucial point here is that this was a structured system. You couldn't just doodle something and hope it worked. No, first you had to identify a very specific need. Then, you'd select the right divine name or symbol that was linked to that outcome. After that, you'd construct the diagram very carefully, and finally, you'd perform a ritual to activate it. It was like a precise spiritual technology.
And you might be thinking this was some fringe practice that just disappeared, but no way. The work of al-Buni had this profound, lasting legacy that you can still see today. You see, al-Buni's real genius might not have been just invention, but synthesis. He was an absolute master at collecting and organizing centuries of this kind of knowledge into one cohesive system. And because of that, his books became the go-to manuals on these topics for hundreds of years. And, like we saw at the beginning, that influence is still going, making him a subject of serious study today as we all try to understand that complex relationship between history, faith, and the human search for meaning.
And all of this leaves us with one final thought to chew on. Al-Buni lived in a world where these practices were a sophisticated field of knowledge. It kind of makes you wonder, doesn't it? In our own lives, in our own time, where do we draw the line between what we call faith and what we call superstition?